onto our presentation. Anaya Jones has 9 years of experience as an academic librarian serving distance students. She is interested in ways that scalable information literacy instruction can remain meaningful and relevant for students, and increasing the accessibility of the library and research services. She has her MLIS and her CPACC. Please welcome Anaya Jones.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Nodding? Perfect.
Yes,
all right.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Nope, that's perfect. Right. Perfect. So thank you all so much for joining me today for using Universal Design for Learning to explore UDL in a community. I'm really excited to talk about my experience with a recent series of collaborations that I did with some colleagues. And so we'll go ahead and get started. I wanted to start out just with a really quick high-level overview of what we'll kind of cover today. We are going to talk a little bit first about Universal Design for Learning, commonly referred to by its acronym UDL. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this because I'm making some assumption that if you are coming to a presentation about using UDL, that you have some background in knowledge in what it is and are already interested in utilizing it. Then I'm also going to talk us through the 3-part workshop that I am in the process of doing. And then we'll talk through areas of growth. And then I'd love to hear from you about what has worked for you using UDL. Or maybe some of what your challenges are, and then we will wrap up. So we'll only do questions. Maybe we'll see how it goes. Whether we want to talk through UDL or do questions first, we can be a little flexible. So to start us off, we're going to talk about Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. This is an educational framework with a focus on flexibility. You're going to hear multiple means a lot because we're going to have multiple means of many different things. And it's inspired by the universal design movement in architecture. It's similar in that both movements are trying to make either architecture or education more accessible for a wider range of people. Both have kind of overarching principles, but otherwise I don't know that I find it particularly helpful to compare the two. They are different enough applications of this idea that that's pretty much where the value for me in comparison ends. I do think it's important to note that Universal Design for Learning can feel a little bit like learning styles, which has been largely debunked as a helpful thing to focus on in our educational practice. But Universal Design for Learning is distinct from learning styles and has a very different aim. UDL was first defined in the 1990s, and it's commonly been associated with K-12 classrooms. And I think that's one of the challenges that I've noted in working with UDL is that a lot of the examples are referencing K-12 education, and that can make it a little bit more difficult to imagine what that looks like in a higher education classroom. I also think that there's further challenges here for librarians who may have different limitations that faculty don't always have on their classroom time with students that can provide some challenges for UDL as well. There's been some good recent scholarship talking about UDL and how we need to go past UDL into inclusive instruction. I would say that's absolutely true, but for me, that doesn't devalue the helpfulness of UDL, because UDL can also be combined with inclusive instruction. So however it makes the most sense for you to think through that, but one thing to consider. So as an introduction to kind of setting to the project, kind of setting the stage. I work at the Northeastern University Libraries, where I'm the accessibility librarian. And prior to my joining our team, we already had this amazing program in place. They called it the Instruction Exchange. Once a month, folks from across the library, anybody who had instructional responsibilities, not just folks from within the research and instruction subunit, would get together and would explore some kind of topic related to instruction. These sessions could take a lot of different formats. Sometimes we have reflected on a couple of questions in collaboration. Sometimes we have a more formal presentation, but it does involve rotating facilitators. And earlier, I think it was late last year, early this year, I don't know, my concept of time is nebulous at best. So a while back, I floated the idea of doing 3 sessions focused on universal design for learning for this group. And we were able to move forward with that. So these sessions are not hosted one after the other. There'll be sometimes a couple of months in between on focusing on other topics, and that is intentional. But it is a 3-part series. And full disclosure, at this point in time, I have given one of these sessions, the engagement session, and the representation and action and expression sessions are planned, but for a little bit more in the future. So the session focuses on the engagement pathway through the Universal Design for Learning standard. And if you're familiar with UDL, you know, it's often represented in a kind of a grid. So there's 3 columns, 3 rows. I decided to separate it by the multiple means of engagement as a category, and then concentrate on the things within that. So that includes recruiting interest, sustaining effort and persistence, and self-regulation. So the next session will deal with perception, language and symbols, and comprehension as part of the multiple means of representation pathway. And the final session will focus on the action and expression pathway, which includes physical action, expression and communication, and executive functions. Now, part of one of the reasons that we've broken this up is that the Universal Design for Learning framework can feel really large and overwhelming. So by breaking it into 3 separate categories, we were able to take more time to really look at the framework in depth. So the primary goals for all of these sessions are to build a resilient and tenacious mindset for revising instructional experiences, to understand how to increase accessibility using the Universal Design for Learning, or UDL framework, and to trade concrete ideas and examples with peers. So when I'm designing goals for any kind of instructional experience, I usually like to include often one of each, but at least one. I think of it as like a big goal, and I think of the other one as a small goal. So even though these sessions are not the only things that will be needed to craft a resilient and tenacious mindset, that is the work of weeks, years, sustained critical reflection, it's still something that I'm trying to support through this work. And I think that having those larger goals in mind can be really important. But trading concrete ideas and examples with peers is a relatively concrete, small chunk kind of goal. And I like to have one of each. I also want to point out the resilient and tenacious mindset for revising instructional experiences at this point. A lot of the work that I do working with folks on accessibility is trying to balance this idea that accessibility is the work. A lot of times we have existed in work environments and educational environments where accessibility isn't thought of at all. And when it's introduced to us as something that we can do to make our work more accessible, it often feels like it is pitched to us as this extra thing that we can do. But yes, it takes a lot of time and effort and education in order to implement it in our work. I think that that is a fundamentally incorrect way to consider the work of accessibility, especially for us as librarians. And I promise I will try to keep this soapbox relatively short, but for us as librarians, the work is making content and information and the instruction that we provide accessible to all of our patrons, to all of our students, to all of our community. The work is not making those things available to some of our community. And so it's important to think about making accessible content, accessible instruction, accessible information, fully accessible as much as possible from the beginning. So it is the work. If we are not making accessible things and instruction and experiences, then we are only doing the work part way. And that is a fundamentally different way to approach it than an extra that takes a lot of effort to implement. That said, approaching something from that kind of radically different mindset can be a really big shift. And we are also human beings who exist in a world where we're asked to do more with less. And that is I think that's a really big tension in the work that I do. I see that a lot. And so I'm trying to kind of balance those things. And when I work with people and collaborate on accessibility, I want to be really cognizant that this is a tension in this work. And I want my colleagues to be taking care of themselves. And I also want them to be prepared to approach the work of accessibility as a long-term project. So that's some of the background for me with this goal. So each of the 3 sessions had or has the same structure. So when I'll send out some information ahead of time, and one of those things is asking them to review the UDL pathway that we're going to use in the session. When we start the session, I will begin each session with the agenda or the plan like we did today, and that's including the overarching plan between all 3 of the sessions. So we're grounding ourselves in where we are in the overall process. We have our goals, and we also know what we're going to do for that specific session. So this is really to support clarity. What's the plan? What are we trying to accomplish? And then at this point, we're also going to do a reflection, a warm-up, or both to kind of shake out any of the kind of cramped feelings from sitting in our chairs for a long time, kind of allow ourselves to approach the work fresh. Participants were asked to review the UDL content in advance, and they were also asked to bring an instructional experience of their own to review. But for the content section, this is really a time to briefly review, have any questions about the content that we're going to be working with addressed in our time together. Each of these sessions is only an hour long, so we really don't have time to both review the content in depth for the first time together and also get to using the content. So we chose to use our time in the activity, which is what we'll do after that. So participants work during the session time on adding multiple means, in this case, or in the case of the first session, multiple means of engagement to their lesson plan or instructional experience. And then we will share out what we worked on with the activity by populating a document with strategies for meeting each of the checkpoints in the UDL framework. So this is, again, reinforcing those specific UDL checkpoints, but in a share out format. And then finally, we debrief and reflect on the session and how participants will take that information forward. So I've labeled this the kind of assess phase. So one of the things that I really liked about doing this work in community, a couple of the things, is it means that we have a dedicated time to explore this topic. This is something that's true of all of the instruction exchange sessions, but I feel like it's very valuable for working with UDL, Universal Design for Learning, any accessibility work. Again, if folks are thinking about it as an extra or something that they need to really take time to engage with, it can be difficult to schedule that time for yourself if you're not really good at cutting out time for you to work on doing that. And so by putting it on our calendars, by having it be an activity that we know we're going to work on this professional development, it establishes that dedicated time to do that work. It also means that by working together, we have space for new ideas or perspectives that one individual person may not come up with just by themselves. There's space for kind of building on each others' ideas throughout that process. There's also space for gentle self and peer accountability as we are working through our understanding of a checkpoint or a pathway through UDL. Talking through that may help us adjust our understanding of that universal design for learning checkpoint as we go based on how our peers are interacting with it. It also means that if we encounter challenges and want to talk through those, we can also have support for some of those challenges with instruction in general, but specifically UDL. So I talked earlier about how I was kind of specifically, I had that goal about cultivating resistance, and I do want to talk about that a little bit more. Some of the things that we did to cultivate resistance is we had 3 sections of content. Breaking it up into smaller pieces makes it feel a little bit more manageable. Each of the sessions followed the same format. That's to help as much as possible things to be expected. We're gonna follow the same format we did last time. There's no surprises. And I've explicitly named resilience in the reflections and goals within the session. It is not a secret to my colleagues that one of the things that we are doing through these sessions is cultivating that resilience. So in the reflections, I will ask things like, how are you feeling today? How resilient do you feel? How much do you feel like you can kind of stretch today? Does today feel like a good stretch day? And so keep that in mind as we are working on this lesson plan. Maybe a time in the future, you will feel more like stretching and you can kind of take on more ambitious changes in your lesson plan or experience. And maybe today is kind of a review and reflect and process day. I think it's important to check in with ourselves and to also build that kind of space into the work that we're doing. I also, I bring this approach both to the spaces that I am hosting, but also into our discussions as colleagues. Slow is better than no, right? This journey of universal design, this journey of accessibility, it's a long one. And it is much better to take things one step at a time, to take things slowly, to make small changes and adjust as we go, than to try to take on everything or even just too much. Maybe it's not everything, but maybe it's a big chunk and it doesn't work, or something about it doesn't work for us and we get kind of burned or burned out, and then we just stop, right? This is a turtle wins the race, not the hare scenario. That's not to say that you shouldn't go out and do the things that you want to do if you have lots of changes to make. Just make sure that you're checking in with yourself and that you're doing things at a sustainable pace for you. What that looks like to different people will be different. So the first session was putting UDL, or the first session was engagement. And I want to talk specifically about how I used universal design for learning checkpoints and best practices in my session for my colleagues on engagement in the multiple means of engagement pathway of universal design for learning. So in terms of recruiting interest, for the activity, participants actually had a choice. So they could first identify a pain point with their activity or instruction, their lesson plan, and then try to identify something in the UDL framework or in the multiple means of engagement pathway that might help students overcome that pain point in their instruction. So this is a very focused way of approaching the activity. The alternate was they could instead take the review the personas that I had started ahead of time, but then we worked on and collaborated on together of students. And they could review their lesson plan with those student personas in mind, and then make universal design for learning changes to their lesson plan to make it better suit the students in those personas. So they had an option in how they completed this activity. They also, as I mentioned earlier, brought their own lesson plan. And so this helped the work be relevant to what they were working on, and to hopefully hold their interest more, because it was more of an active work session than just learning about something that they would then need the time to implement later. In terms of persistence, we reviewed the goals and plans at the beginning of the session. And we also included, I say we, but it's me. I included multiple opportunities for collaboration. So if people were maybe struggling with persistence or felt like they weren't quite sure where to go from there, there were collaborative opportunities where they could engage with their peers, their colleagues, in order to help move them forward. In terms of self-regulation, we specifically talked in the session about coping with the large and often sometimes overwhelming nature of UDL. We sometimes seeing these established practices aided in motivation. So being able to talk about things that they already did that met UDL checkpoints actually aided motivation, because people felt like, oh, this isn't quite as overwhelming. I'm already doing some of this, right? We also built in several points for reflection on the process. We had reflections before we got started with the activity about how people are feeling, how willing they feel like they are to engage or able. And we also had reflections after the activity, where they could reflect on, well, how am I going to move this forward? How am I going to apply this to some of my other instructional opportunities? So looking at using UDL in the representation session. So again, this is one that I haven't hosted yet, but I've got all of my plans ready and I'm ready to do it at the end of this month. We are working through the perception, language and symbols, and comprehension pathways. So for perception, I'll make sure that auto captions are available. I will verbally describe what's on the slide content. I try to build this into my practice as much as possible. So you'll notice that during this presentation, I'm not describing something to you if it is also in the words that I'm saying. I'm not going to kind of duplicate efforts that way. But if we did have an image on the screen or something else that is not text-based or kind of that I can describe that is already kind of verbally, I will make it a point to say, and here's what's on the slide, and describe that verbally. This next time, I also shared videos along with the pre-reading. So I took a couple of minutes to find an organization that was doing kind of overview videos, relatively short, that talk about each of the sections of the UDL pathway that we were going to cover. And I offered those along with a link to the pre-reading. I also was intentional about sharing the slides ahead of time. So if folks would like to review and know what is coming up, they can, or if it is easier for them to perceive that content in that way, they have multiple options for doing that. Under language and symbols, the one thing that I pointed out, or that I try to do, is make sure that we say the full name of something before the acronym, and definitely introduce any acronym before we use it. Under comprehension, I will make connections to information that we've learned in the previous session, and I will highlight instructional choices that can serve multiple UDL checkpoints. So sometimes there are choices that we can make that will serve multiple UDL checkpoints. And this is kind of a way of connecting to previous things that we've learned. It's also ways of building connections between different but similar elements within the framework. I don't have an example prepped, so if I come across one, I'll mention it. And then for the third session, which I'm hoping to do maybe later this summer or early next fall, will be focusing on the action and expression pathway. So how we will we will use UDL in our UDL session. For physical action, we're going to have the slides and the collaborative documents are reviewed before my peers get them for accessibility. When I present in Teams, I'll use the PowerPoint live present. Zoom doesn't have a associated function. Sorry, I blanked out on the words I needed there. Although Zoom is generally better referred for accessibility of presentations, but Microsoft Teams, when we do present in there, has a specific live presentation option that allows users to kind of flip back and forth between slides on their own speed, which is nice. So if you are presenting in Teams, we can use that. In terms of expression and communication, we want to give folks the options to communicate out in the way that works for them. So they can either type in the chat, they can unmute and talk. We have different options there. For executive function, the collaborative nature of the activities can allow my colleagues to suggest appropriate goals, next steps for themselves, and even build strategies. And the reflection on the next steps in the process and how previous sessions have gone is going to help cement, what worked, what didn't work, what can we maybe do differently. So in terms of what I would like to do differently after giving the first session in this series, I'm going to adjust the way that I do breakout rooms. So in addition to allowing folks different ways of completing the activity, I also had different options for how they collaborated. So if they wanted to work by themselves, they could. If they wanted to work in a small group, they could. And if they wanted to work in a large group, they could. And I had breakout rooms for those things. But what I did was I made the sort of default room that people were already in, the quiet workspace, kind of accidentally. And then folks who wanted to be in a group could go off to another breakout room. And I found that I was trying to be there for questions in the quiet workspace, but then I'd pop over to the breakout room where people were having really great conversations, and I didn't want to not be available for questions in the other room, but here I am in the breakout room, like I didn't want to miss anything. So I'm going to instead, I think, have that that larger collaborative space be in the main kind of default room, and then allow breakout rooms for quiet work this next time. Also, if I figure out the ability to clone myself or time travel so that I can just be in all the places at once, that would be a suitable alternative. Fingers crossed on that one. I'll let you know how it goes. Otherwise, what we did seemed to work out fairly well. And I think it's, in terms of things that I would like to do differently as an instructor, is just trying to remember and constantly remind myself to highlight those connections between things as we were working through the activities. So my next slide is let's hear from you. But I want to check in first if anybody has any questions before we, let's do both. If you've got questions, put them in the chat. If you'd like to share an experience, I'd love to hear from that too. So I'd love to know if you have what's been successful when you have tried to teach or implement universal design for learning, and what hasn't been successful, or what challenges have you encountered?
I think we've all encountered the trying to clone yourself or time travel. Definitely. I mean, even when it's on-site work and I'm walking around from group to group.
Mm-hmm.
So let me know how that works.
Will do. Yeah. Okay. And I think when we're in the classroom with students, you can have kind of a sense of how loud other groups are, even if you're not actively talking to them. When we're talking about breakout rooms, it's a completely separate, you're very effectively partitioned.
Yeah, it's tough. Do you find have the sessions, have they been well received? I mean, do you see, because I love teaching something and seeing light bulbs go off. Do you,
It was very well received. I mean, part
Good.
of it is that, my colleagues did a lot of groundwork in having these instructional exchange sessions already. So folks come to that space ready to do that kind of work. So I absolutely want to recognize how helpful that was in starting out. But yeah, absolutely. Folks were completely willing to engage. And they also, I think one of the biggest light bulb moments that came out of that initial session was, oh, I'm doing some of this already. And that was really powerful because I feel like it makes the entire process more approachable. The UDL can feel really big, but if you can see that choices that you've already made are kind of doing some of those things, it's like, oh, I'm not a bad teacher after all. I mean, we're not bad teachers, right? I like to tell my colleagues, like, I'm here to help you, like, do the things that you do really well even better. Nobody is starting from scratch.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point. Definitely. Anybody have any questions for Anaya? Anybody have any comments?
Hi.
I just want to say I was in your presentation for NELIG as well. I really appreciate that you chunked it because I had to take a class at our school about this, and I'm supposed to present it to the librarians. So it's nice to have an example of how you've kind of chunked it for them. So I'm probably going to borrow that. It's a good idea.
I think it makes a lot of sense trying to cover the entire UDL at once. I mean, I've mentioned it before in another presentation where we did like a really high level, but to try, unless you have a day-long retreat or something, doing the entire thing in one go feels very overwhelming.
And then trying to fit all the information in all at once.
Yeah.
Anne is asking, is there any particular subject area that finds this challenging?
So I think the challenges differ based on what, I think the challenges can be different based on the subject area. And they can also be different based on the level that you're teaching at too. So, I mentioned earlier in the presentation that I think a lot of our examples for UDL, and there are now really great examples for higher ed. So this is not true across the board, but for a good bit of time, most of the examples were from the K-12 sphere. And so we would see some of the examples and be like, okay, but I'm not doing that. Like, some of them would make sense. You could immediately see how they would apply to other areas. But some of them were like, well, that doesn't make sense based on my context. So I'm not sure how to interpret this guideline, right? One of the other things I think it's important to note is, especially as we are taking a slow is better than no approach, you don't have to figure out how to apply every single one of the guidelines all at once. When I had my review slides where I showed you what I did from each of the lesson plans, I didn't hit every single bit of UDL in this session. I tried to do as much as I felt like was relevant, but for the session that I was giving had its own challenges. There are some elements for UDL that have to do with assessment, and I wasn't really in a place where I was going to assess my colleagues for this low stakes professional development type session. So those, I didn't feel like I needed to work really hard to implement those. Some things are fairly standard across subject disciplines in the higher ed space. Like there are things you can do to make your syllabus more following a UDL kind of approach. Those are going to be relatively the same, but when it comes time to be in the classroom, how you do that is very likely going to depend on the subject area. That's probably about as much as I can say without a more specific subject area knowledge on that, but certainly if I have not answered your question, let me know.
Any other questions or comments?
We do have several minutes left. So if you would just like to chat, I'm open to that.
I think it's a lot to digest.
It is.
What have you found that people have struggled with the most?
I think there are, so to answer that question, I'm actually going to pull up the UDL CAST website. See. So they have this really great kind of chart format for the different guidelines. And I think the ones that are harder to engage, especially when we're talking about one-shots or library instruction that might be more limited, might be things like guiding appropriate goal setting. Like, that's not impossible, but it may be something that we have to work a little bit more intentionally to integrate into our instruction. Some of the ones that, not to say they don't involve work, but are a little bit more straightforward are things like offering alternatives for auditory information. So if you say something, is it also in writing? If you write something, is there also a way to access it in another way? Those are probably going to be the same, you're going to interpret them in pretty similar ways, regardless of the context that you're using the guidelines for. But things like increasing mastery-oriented feedback. If you're in a one-shot, that may be something that you're going to need to work a little harder to integrate with. There are other resources like this website that you would recommend for folks who are new to UDL, especially ones who don't have a library instruction community at their institution. Yeah, so this is, this is sort of the resource in that it is the guidelines. These same folks have, and I don't have it immediately propped up, so it might take me just a second to find it, but the same CAST folks have a website about UDL in higher ed. And let's see if it's fairly easy to find, because it is really helpful. Here we go, UDL on campus. So this website is one that I would suggest for folks who are new to UDL. Another thing that I might suggest is, if you've got access to the ALA forums or other local kind of things, like put it out there. Like, I'm working on implementing UDL in my instruction. I'd love to connect with other folks who are doing the same and maybe do like a peer review. Anytime that we can work with folks who are doing similar work to us, especially in instruction, doing that in community, I find really helpful. So that community might look different if you don't have a resource like this at your institution, but being able to make some of those connections, I would highly recommend. Are there any sources you'd recommend for implementing UDL with students who identify as neurodiverse? Great question. I don't have any specific resources, but UDL is absolutely for neurodiverse students. So I'm sure that there are articles and books out there. I don't have any at the tip of my fingers that are specifically for doing that, but all of the guidelines that we were talking about are meant to support students with physical disabilities, but also students who are neurodiverse and are approaching it in a slightly different way. So this is the right place. In thinking about the last breakout session I attended, do you have suggestions for how to apply UDL to gamification or game-based learning in library instruction? Immediate, tangible suggestions, probably not, but I don't think that these things are antithetical to each other. I think you could absolutely do them together, especially when we're talking about building strategies for motivation. gamifying your instruction, that sounds great, as long as you're also connecting that to why students need the information later. I think that is a really excellent dovetail. Some of the challenges with gamifying your instruction and using UDL at the same time is that a lot of times gamifying instruction does require building games and things. And if you're not really intentional about having multiple ways for people to get the information, multiple ways for them to show you their learning, that can get tougher because it took more time to set up the gamification process than it would if you just wrote a Word document, right? So I think it's very possible. And I think in some ways gamification can support UDL, but I would just caution you to be really intentional in the planning phase. Because if you plan this really, really awesome game that isn't accessible from the beginning, you're going to introduce more challenges for yourself later in trying to also approach it from UDL, or even just accessibility if someone has accommodations with your school's disability resource center. Thank you all for the questions. These are so great.
Any other questions or comments?
So I advanced my slides just because I do want to encourage you all to write down my email. And if you have questions that occur to you later and you'd like to chat about it, please don't hesitate to reach out. Also, if you are working on something with UDL and want to chat through it with someone, I'm always game to be that collaborative community for folks as well.